Now that we've wrapped up the EAR licensing process, we're going to move on to another topic entitled Anti-Boycott Provisions under the Export Administration Regulations. Let's dive right in. So what is it we're talking about here? Anti-boycott. What does that mean? Well, first bullet point, anti-boycott laws were adopted in the late 70s to compel U.S. persons to refuse participation in foreign boycotts that the United States government does not support. This is going back a ways, 40 years, 40 plus years. Second bullet point, the two primary anti-boycott laws are the amendments to the Export Administration Act, the EAA, and the Ribicoff Amendment to the Tax Reform Act, known as the TRA. Two different government agencies enforce these laws. The first sub-bullet point, Commerce enforces the Export Administration Act, while it's the Treasury Department that enforces the Tax Reform Act. A boycott is really a policy that's put in place not to do business with a certain country, company, organization. Could be any one of several scenarios. But here what we're talking about, as you'll see in our first bullet point, is that the primary country that these laws aim to prevent boycotts against is Israel. So we're talking about other countries, primarily members of the Arab League and a couple of other rogue players, that have put boycotts in place against the state of Israel. The United States government doesn't like that. Israel is a major ally of ours. We have a free trade agreement with Israel. That's what anti-boycott provisions are mostly all about, preventing boycott activity specific to Israel by certain players. Second bullet point, the BIS provisions for anti-boycott activities are found in Part 760 to the EAR. It's called Restrictive Trade Practices or Boycotts. Part 760 lists specific conduct that U.S. persons are prohibited from engaging in. And of course, we're going to tell you what those behaviors are. As we see in our title, we're taking this information straight out of the anti-boycott prohibitions under EAR Part 760.2. So the specific prohibitions related to anti-boycott activities coming out of 760.2 are refusal to do business. Straight up, we will not do business with Israel type of statement or type of request from a country that is participating in these boycotts against Israel. Any discriminatory action against Israel or Israelis. Furnishing information about race, religion, sex, or national origin. A customer in a Middle Eastern country asking you for specific information about the race, religion, sex, or national origin of a party involved in the transaction. That's a no-no under anti-boycott prohibitions. Furnishing information about business relationships with boycotted countries or blacklisted persons. Again, the implicit understanding is we're talking about Israel, but it doesn't have to be just limited to Israel. Continuing on, some of the other specific prohibitions related to anti-boycott activities. First sub-bullet point, any information concerning association with charitable and fraternal organization, or one of the biggest areas where you see boycott terminology, boycott requests, is found in a letter of credit. We have an actual example of that coming up soon, so make a mental note. It's not unusual under very specific circumstances to see anti-boycott wording in a letter of credit. So some reporting requirements. The U.S. government has specific regs in place related to anti-boycott activities. Should an exporter, should a U.S. PPI, a seller of goods in the United States, come across anti-boycott activities, they are compelled to report those activities. First bullet point, the EAR requires U.S. persons to report quarterly requests they have received to take certain actions to comply with, further, or support an unsanctioned foreign boycott. It's on a quarterly basis. This requirement applies to shippers, forwarders, as well as any party acting on behalf of the shipper. So it's not just a seller-buyer type relationship or a seller-buyer type requirement as it relates to anti-boycott activities. If anybody involved in an export transaction is aware of anti-boycott activities, they are compelled to report this information. As a quick trade tip, these quarterly reports have to be filed to BIS on Form 621P. And hopefully you know what's coming in the next slide, because we've been pretty consistent throughout all of our modules and sections. You guessed it, a closer look at BIS Form 621P. This is actually a one-page document. We broke it down in two to make it maybe a little bit easier to see. We'll be the first to admit that the font is a little small here, but we want to run through the most important components of the Form 621P. So let's do that. You'll see in our title of this document, it's a report of request for restrictive trade practice or boycott single transaction. After some information on a notice of right to protect certain information from disclosure, the form gets right down to business. 1A, identify the firm submitting this report. So who's reporting it? Could be the shipper, could be the seller, could be a freight forwarder, could be a carrier, could be a bank on a letter of credit. So they have to identify themselves. And on the right-hand side, be specific about what their role is in a given transaction. Exporter, bank, forwarder, what we just mentioned. And then on 1B, type an X in any applicable box. Is the reporting party submitting a revision of a previous report? Is it a resubmission of a deficient report returned by BIS? Or is it a report on behalf of the person identified in item 2? We'll get to that in a second. Or a dual report on behalf of self and the person in item 2. So in item 2, if you are authorized to report and are reporting on behalf of another U.S. person, identify that person. Who is it? Number 3, identify the exporting firm, unless it's the same as 1A or 2. 4, who's the boycotting country? Who's the offending party here? And we're not going to single out countries. We'll show a list from the Department of Treasury in a couple of slides, but we're not going to get into naming countries just yet. But name of the boycotting country from which the request originated, and then the name of country directing inclusion of request if it's different. Name of country or countries, we're in 5 now, against which request is directed, probably Israel. 6, tying into documentation. This is an interesting one. Reporting firm's reference number. Did it come off of a letter of credit? Was it on a customer order to us as the exporter, for example? Was it on an invoice? So we have to identify the specific document that we saw this terminology on, this anti-boycott verbiage. What was the date that this request, this boycott participation request came in? And then moving down to 8, one has to specify the types of document conveying the request to participate in a boycott by typing an X in the appropriate box. Request to carrier for blacklist certificate. In essence, a steamship line being asked to state that a maritime shipment, that a maritime sailing will not transit through a port in Israel, Haifa, probably. Perhaps it was unwritten nor otherwise provided for. Maybe it was verbal. Maybe it came in on a letter of credit. Maybe it was on a requisition, purchase order, accepted contract, or shipping instruction, bid invitation, on a questionnaire, probably a request for information, an RFI, as it's called, or other. So you can see that this report is pretty specific. Who, what, when, where, and how is basically what they're asking. They want details. 9, wrapping this up, what's the decision on the request? If we're the exporter submitting this report or a forwarder submitting this report, what did we do with the request that we received to participate in a boycott? Well, have not taken and will not take the action requested. That's probably a good option. Have taken or will take the action requested. Pretty hard to believe that someone would do that, but there's a box there. Have taken or will take the action requested, but in a modified form. Unable to report ultimate decision on the request at this time. So again, lots of details here. The government's pretty serious about anti-boycott activities. They want to know who's involved in this and the specifics of a particular transaction. All of that can be captured and reported quarterly on BIS Form 621P. Let us carry on. So some prohibited activities under the EAA and the TRA. So some anti-boycott activities that may be penalized under the EAA and or the TRA include agreements to refuse or actually refusing to do business with or in Israel or with blacklisted companies. You can't do that without being penalized. Any agreement that a seller and exporter might enter into to discriminate or actually discriminating against other persons based on race, religion, sex, national origin, or nationality. Continuing on, first sub-bullet point, activities that can be penalized. Agreements to furnish or actually furnishing information about business relationships with or in Israel or with blacklisted companies. Something to point out, we saw this on the previous slide, an agreement to furnish or actually furnishing. So there's a statement whereby perhaps we're the exporter that we agree to do this, that can be penalized, or if we actually do it, of course, it can be penalized too. So it's not just the actual action. A simple agreement to engage in anti-boycott activity can be penalized. Important to point that out. Second sub-bullet point, agreements to furnish or actually furnishing information about the race, religion, sex, or national origin of another person. And the last sub-bullet point, we talked about letters of credit. We'll see some more on it in just a bit. But implementing letters of credit containing prohibited boycott terms or conditions. Can't do that either. So let's bring up a real-world scenario. As we promised, anti-boycott language in a letter of credit. What do we have here? A company in Kuwait has opened a letter of credit in favor of a U.S. manufacturer of fiber optic cable. Under the terms of the letter of credit, the U.S. firm has to present a number of documents, including one original and 2 copies of the commercial invoice. That's not unusual at all. However, while reviewing the details of the letter of credit, the finance director from the fiber optic producer notices that the Kuwaiti company has stipulated that the commercial invoice state none of the goods listed in this commercial invoice and that are covered under LC number 1342868 were purchased or produced in Israel. The million-dollar question is this type of terminology permissible under U.S. anti-boycott prohibitions? Well, since we've explained what anti-boycott terminology is, we've mentioned that it's mostly against Israel by the Arab League and other rogue nations. The answer to this question should be pretty evident. So think about it for a second and we'll pop it up here. Pursuant to EAR 760, any anti-boycott language found in a letter of credit is prohibited and should be reported to the BIS Office of Anti-Boycott Compliance. So if we were this fiber optic cable company, we'd have to break out Form 621P. Good thing we just went over that a couple of minutes ago. This is the U.S. Department of the Treasury list of countries requiring participation in a boycott. And we should note, as you'll see down in the lower right-hand corner, this list can change. But as of the date of taping this module, this is what we have. And one doesn't have to be a geography major to figure out what part of the world we're talking about and why such anti-boycott activities would be undertaken against the state of Israel. With that said, we have Bahrain, Lebanon, Libya, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Syria, the UAE, United Arab Emirates, and Yemen. So as an exporter, if we're doing business or even receiving requests to do business with companies in these countries, we need to be especially attentive to any type of anti-boycott verbiage in any of the documents. A request for quotation, a request for information, a purchase order, a letter of credit, whatever the documentation trail entails. For a link to boycotting countries, you'll find it here. So with that, we're going to wrap up this section. And in the next and final section on EAR, we're going to talk about record keeping under the Export Administration regulations. We look forward to seeing you on the flip side.